In 1994, David Noble stumbled across trees that shouldn't have existed while on a routine hike. Up to 40 meters tall, with strange bark and foliage resembling a giant fern. He broke off a small branch and put it in his backpack. When botanists examined the sample, they couldn't believe what they were looking at. It was Wollemia, a genus of tree believed extinct for roughly 2 million years. Fewer than 60 mature trees remained in the wild. Almost all of them were genetically identical, clones of one distant ancestor. Australia launched an unprecedented rescue operation for the species. No other plant in the world had ever needed to be simultaneously hidden from people and mass propagated to save it from extinction. But the hardest part of this story was only just beginning. The first reactions from specialists were cautious. A few days later, Noble shows the branch to Wyn Jones, a botanist with the National Park Service. Jones examines the dried foliage and can't say anything for certain. There is simply too little material to draw a conclusion. He brings in botanists from the Royal Botanic Garden, Sydney. They don't recognize the species either. A month later, the team returns to the canyon to photograph it and collect bark, cones, and fertile material. It takes another year to officially describe the find. In 1995, a paper appears in the journal Telopia, a new genus and species, Wollemia nobilis, named for Wollemi National Park and for Noble himself. Previously, the species was known only from rock impressions up to 90 million years old. Araucariaceae, the family that includes the Wollemi pine, kauri, and Araucaria, dominated southern hemisphere forests in the age of the dinosaurs. This particular branch of the family tree was believed to have died out millions of years ago. Instead, it had been quietly growing in a single gorge 150 kilometers from Australia's largest city, unnoticed because the canyon is only reachable by rope or helicopter. Almost immediately after the discovery, the species found itself threatened by the very people trying to save it. A helicopter sent to collect cones for research accidentally clipped branches off one of the trees with its rotor. The National Park Service realized that any careless intervention could cost the species its life. The gorge's coordinates were kept entirely secret. Even today, the exact location is known only to a small circle of people who enter following biosecurity protocols and sterilized footwear. The problem turned out to run deeper than secrecy alone could fix. All the surviving trees are concentrated across 4 sites within a single gorge system covering less than 10 square kilometers. Genetic studies found no difference whatsoever between any of the trees. Researchers checked dozens of different genetic markers, and the result came back the same every time. Scientists believe the species passed through a critical genetic bottleneck 10,000 to 26,000 years ago, when the population may have dropped to just 1 or 2 trees. Every tree growing in that gorge today is, in essence, a clone of that same ancestor. The very reason the tree managed to survive so long with such poor genetic diversity is a quirk of its anatomy, not any genetic advantage. Wollemia nobilis can coppice on its own, sending up new trunks from hidden buds near the base of the old tree, even with no damage at all. Individual specimens have been recorded with more than 40 trunks growing from a single root system. That means a tree science considers one organism may actually be hundreds of years older than any single trunk visible above ground. An old trunk dies off, and a new one replaces it from the same root system. It is likely this ability, rather than any fire resistance in the leaves or bark, that let the species survive the small local fires that regularly pass through the canyon, though this strategy would offer no protection against a true firestorm on the open sandstone plateaus above the gorge. This points to something that makes secrecy a matter of life and death rather than a bureaucratic formality. A species that survived 200 million years of climate shifts, continental drift, and the extinction of the dinosaurs is now so genetically uniform that a single pathogen could theoretically wipe out the entire wild population at once. In November 2005, this nearly happened, just weeks after the species was first officially presented to the world. Wild trees were found infected with Phytophthora cinnamomi, a water mold that attacks plant roots. Rangers believe it was carried in by unauthorized visitors who entered the gorge without permission. The response became a two-front strategy running at once. On one side, protecting the wild grove down to the last branch. On the other, mass propagating and distributing the species worldwide so that even a catastrophe in a single gorge wouldn't mean the end of the species. Collecting seed from the wild was judged too risky, since any intervention threatened the young plants. Instead, a cutting propagation program was launched. The Royal Botanic Garden, Sydney, and a team of horticulturists, including David Van Berkel, who led the seedling distribution effort, cultivated thousands of clones from a limited number of parent lines. Before reaching thousands of clones, researchers at Mount Annan had to solve a basic problem first: how to get a Wollemi pine cutting to root at all. For most conifers, that means treating the cut end with synthetic auxin-based hormones, a standard practice that works on Wollemi pine relatives like the Norfolk Island pine. Initial trial treatments using the same hormones on Wollemi pine gave inconsistent, unclear results. So the team decided to test the simplest possibility. What if hormones weren't needed at all? A controlled experiment gave a clear answer. Cuttings rooted with no chemical assistance whatsoever, 71% of tip cuttings and 82% of lower stem cuttings produced roots on their own, and adding hormone treatment made no improvement to the result. A tree that's genetically almost indistinguishable from itself turned out to be remarkably easy to propagate precisely because of this trait. And that became one of the reasons the mass cloning program was able to ramp up so quickly. The very coppicing mechanism that helps the tree survive small fires or damage in the wild canyon meant that numerous cuttings could be taken from each mature tree without harming it. The tree's natural habit of sending up new trunks from hidden buds turned out to be an unexpected ally for the propagation program. The same trait that had protected the species for millions of years in one gorge now helped spread it around the world. The general public learned about the discovery before the scientific community did, thanks to a single article. On December 14, 1994, before the species had even been formally described, Sydney Morning Herald journalist James Woodford published a front-page story under a headline announcing the discovery of a living dinosaur-age tree. The piece ran just months after the find itself, while botanists were still working on identifying the samples, and it instantly spread through media worldwide. That same year, the journal Nature described the find as a prehistoric pine that Australia was paying tribute to. The Royal Botanic Gardens director at the time called it the botanical equivalent of finding a living small dinosaur on Earth, a phrase quoted for decades afterward. Because of all the attention, individual trees in the gorge started getting their own names, not scientific labels, but the names of people involved in the discovery and protection of the species. The tree Noble took his first sample from was named after him. Others after the scientists involved in identifying it. On October 23, 2005, 11 years after Noble's discovery, the Royal Botanic Garden officially introduced the Wollemi pine to the world. Presentations had already taken place in London, Frankfurt, and Tokyo. That same day in Sydney, Sotheby's held an auction of a first-generation collector's edition, 292 seedlings across 148 lots, each with a certificate tracing its lineage back to one of 15 specific wild trees, noting that parent tree's height, girth, and number of trunks. More than 400 buyers and journalists gathered under a marquee near the Royal Gardens Herbarium. Bidding started at 3 in the afternoon and wrapped up within 3 hours. A white glove sale, meaning every single lot sold. Only the second such result in the auction house's history in Australia. The total came to $1,059,165 Australian dollars, including buyer's premium and tax, more than double Sotheby's low estimate. The most expensive lot, a 15-tree collection named Sir Joseph Banks, sold for $135,625 before tax. According to the Sydney Morning Herald, the same buyer ultimately purchased 47 trees in total for around $230,000. A batch of 20 trees destined for a Parisian avenue went to a buyer for just $21,600. The following 14 years passed without dramatic turns. Seedlings simply kept spreading around the world into nurseries, private gardens, and botanical collections on every continent with a temperate climate. The species seemed secured. At the time, it looked like the hardest part of the work was done. The most dramatic test of the whole strategy came with the 2019 to 2020 fire season. The Gospers Mountain mega fire, sparked by a lightning strike in October, burned through more than 512,000 hectares and bore down on Wollemi National Park. New South Wales Environment Minister Matt Keane called what followed an unprecedented environmental protection operation. Large air tankers dropped fire retardant in a protective ring around the grove. Specialist firefighting crews were lowered from helicopters on ropes directly into the gorge to set up an irrigation system and keep the ground moist as the fire passed through. The goal was simple. If fire reached the trees, it needed to burn through as a cool ground fire rather than a scorching one. Everyone involved in the operation was sworn to secrecy about the exact location. The fire did reach the grove. For 4 days, the smoke was so thick that crews couldn't tell whether the plan had worked. Keane later said everyone was holding their breath, waiting. On January 15, 2020, the government officially announced the outcome. A few trees were scorched, 2 died. The rest survived. The wild population held, but by 2020, the species had long since stopped depending on that one gorge alone. In 2006, seedlings went on sale in nurseries at a retail price of $55 to $95 per tree, less than the cost of a coffee and a sandwich on auction day, for a species that just a year earlier had sold for $6,000 a tree. 6 groves were donated to conservation organizations in Australia, New Zealand, Britain, Germany, and Japan. To this day, Wollemi pines grow in gardens and parks around the world, from the botanical gardens of Sydney to private yards in northern England. Not a single documented case of illegal collection from the wild has been recorded. The distribution strategy succeeded so completely that demand for the wild plant simply disappeared. Alongside selling clones worldwide, the recovery team launched another experiment that few people outside scientific journals ever heard about. In the mid-2010s, researchers led by Heidi Zimmer of the Australian Botanic Garden planted a group of Wollemia nobilis seedlings at a new wild site, chosen specifically as insurance against a single point of failure. It was an attempt to establish a second wild population from scratch. 2 years later, 85% of the transplanted plants had survived. Interestingly, the transplanted trees split into 2 distinct groups. Some barely grew at all, but almost all survived, 94%. Others grew faster but died more often, with only 69% making it to the end of the experiment. What determined the outcome was not genetics, since all the plants are genetically identical, but the condition of the seedling at the time of transplanting and how much light reached that particular gap in the forest canopy. In the wild gorge, seed itself is a weak hope. Seed viability for Wollemia nobilis runs at roughly 10%, and a quarter of what is viable gets damaged by animals before it can even germinate. In the wild, the number of seedlings varies wildly year to year, some years none at all, other years as many as 60 at once. Of those that germinate, 65% die in the first year, but the ones that survive that first year have a real chance. Over 16 years of monitoring, 44% of established young plants survive to the end of the study, growing slowly in the deep shade of the mature trees at less than 2 centimeters a year. The cause of this bottleneck between germination and survival still isn't precisely known. It could be low light, leaf litter buildup, soil pathogens, or a lack of the right microbial root partners. Data gathered after the fire revealed something nobody had been able to observe before. Exactly how a mature wild Wollemi pine responds to fire under natural conditions. Before 2019, this kind of opportunity simply hadn't existed. A fire of that scale had never reached the grove in the time people had been watching it. That information has since become part of the long-term fire risk management plan for the species. Fieldwork on this species carries a particular complication that hasn't gone away even after 30 years of research. Because of coppicing, scientists still can't say for certain how many genetically distinct trees are actually growing in the gorge. Several trunks that look like separate trees may turn out to share the same root system. That makes even the simple question of how many trees are left harder to answer than it sounds. After the 2019 to 2020 fires, it became clear that simply distributing clones to gardens around the world wasn't enough. In October 2023, a new phase of the program launched, a so-called meta collection. More than 170 young trees, grown in Sydney from an improved genetic selection of parent lines, were sent out to 28 botanical gardens across the UK and Europe via the Bedgebury Nursery in Kent, as well as to 5 gardens in Australia and 1 in the United States, in Atlanta. The goal is to gather together every bit of genetic variation that can be found among the clones and spread it across multiple climate zones at once so that no single disaster, natural or human-caused, can wipe out every line simultaneously. Meanwhile, trees planted back in the mid-2000s have started maturing enough to produce seed of their own. In October 2025, at Wakehurst, Kew's sister garden in Sussex, the nursery team recorded what botanists are calling a bumper year. Instead of the usual 20 to 30 seeds per season, the cones yielded 168, of which roughly 134 turned out to be potentially viable. This made it possible, for the first time, to deposit seed collected at Wakehurst itself into the Millennium Seed Bank, the world's largest wild plant seed vault, which marked its own 25th anniversary that same year. Every seed in that vault represents, in theory, a new gene combination that officially shouldn't exist in a species that, by every scientific account, lost its genetic variation tens of thousands of years ago.